Welcome, dear friends, to everybody who is listening to us today. So this episode of The Fog of War, we are recording in the heart of Kyiv, in the office of our good friends, the Ukrainians media, who specialize in long-form journalism as reportages, interviews, features, and thought-provoking columns. But what truly sets them apart are their printed works, books and magazines. They capture human stories from Ukraine during this war. If you'd like to explore their work, we'd leave a link below. And today with us, we have actually the editor of the Ukrainians media, a journalist, a curator of cultural projects, Bohdana Neborak.
Glad to be here, Yaroslava.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. As usual, it's me, Yaroslava Buchta, it's Jonathan Fink, and let's dive into our questions. Yeah, so I would like to start with the question about books and publishing, especially publishing of Ukrainian literature abroad. So there seems to be quite a few things translated. And yet, if somebody asks me, for example, of where I can find a book of Ukrainian author or a book in Ukrainian, what should I start with? And I point them to some classical Ukrainian literature, it's very hard to actually find it in bookshops in the UK, for example. So I was wondering, why is this still a situation? What needs to change for the book publishing industry, perhaps, to change in the way that we see these books on the bookshelves abroad?
Such a big question for the very beginning, and here we need to start with the structure of how publishing looks like in English-speaking world. Because we have publishers who are the first actor, then we have book distributors who are the second, and then we have the booksellers. And it really influences which book distributor does the publisher have. Because a very good example when we come to Ukrainian literature is Andrei Kurkov. He is the best known Ukrainian author abroad. He is best translated contemporary Ukrainian author abroad, and his English language publisher is Penguin Books. So in any airport in the world, you will probably find Andrei Kurkov's book if there is a bookstore. Another example, which is from another generation of Ukrainian writers, is Alexander Mehad. Alexander Mehad, I suppose he also was a guest of yours.
He was. In fact, we had the great pleasure of meeting him yesterday.
He is outstanding author, and also he is a part of Ukrainian military right now. And he wrote a fascinating book about the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And also he was published by the imprint of Penguin Books. And when I was in Paris last year, but also in several other European capitals, I saw his book, The Language of War, at different European bookstores who sell Ukrainian literature in English translation. And what is very important, it was aside books of people whom we call Russian opposition. So there is a topic, let's call it on Ukraine, and Alexander Mehad is there. Another example is Miroslav Layuk, who wrote a book, Bakhmut. It is the book about the Battle of Bakhmut, but also it tells us what is war like here in Ukraine and how it influences our values. It is a recent book, and it has just been published in Czech. And I also was following the Czech bookstores, and I understand that these books lays aside books from Russia, books from people who write about Russia and who write about this war from the Russian perspective. So it is very important to get those books to the bookstores. I also want to say that right now we are speaking in English, in this international kind of English. I think that maybe Jonathan speaks another English when he speaks to his friends in Oxford. But what I wanted to say is that several years ago, PEN International said a very wise thing about the book industry and literature in translation into English language. It was done in the US. And they told that only 3% of all the books at the English language book market are translations. And inside of these 3%, we need to seek for Ukrainian literature. Then it was considered a problem, especially in Great Britain, and British people were trying to do something with it. But as far as I know right now, the whole percent is not higher than 5-6%, so it is not so much. People whose native language is English in general read what was written in English. Definitely it is super influenced, for instance, with International Booker Prize. And a very good example was several years ago when the professor of Ukrainian studies, William Blacker, was in the jury of International Booker Prize. First of all, you come to the website of International Booker and you see that there is a translator of Ukrainian literature. There is a job like this. So probably there is literature that he translates. And that really changes everything. I think that such things, they shift the tendencies. But moving back to your question, definitely we need much more translations. But it is also a very huge question. And I don't know if you want to dive right now into this, because it's so much about the context, it's so much about the history, it's also about academia and about the translators, where the translators arise, how they are educated, how they can find a job. Being a Ukrainian translator is not that easy. Also, we need to remember that Ukrainian regained independence only in 1991. So before, Ukrainian language was the language of stateless country, and it is not that attractive for young people who come to academia to decide they want to study Ukrainian language. Definitely, if they have any ties with the region, I mean Russia, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, they had this bias that Russian is enough, and they frequently studied Russian. But to sum this all up, I want to say about the UNESCO database of translations of fiction. And it shows that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was less and less demand in Russian language, in translations from the Russian language. So the things change, but we always need to remind ourselves how we were educated and how the people with whom we speak were educated. And probably they were educated with this focus, for instance, on Russian language. Probably not, but often it is the issue.
And it's a different type of literature. So, for instance, if we're going to go and seek out modern Russian literature, if it's the popular stuff, then it's going to be Boris Akunin, who, of course, I'm not sure, I don't think he's definitely Russian. I think he's Georgian, isn't he? Or if it's more literary, it's going to be Dina Prichnika and that kind of thing. But if it's Ukrainian literature, and I went to lots of bookshelves, and if they've got a reasonably good collection, the trouble is it's really seen through the lens of war. You've got Alexander Mikhed, you've got war and trauma. You've got Sergei Plakhy, Chernobyl, but still, it's the literature and the study of trauma and the view of Ukraine, I don't say necessarily as a victim, but through that lens, not through the lens of anything else. Is this even when you get more writers published, is this still going to be a challenge to break out of that sense of trauma, war, or even, let's say, victimhood?
It is definitely a challenge, and we may speak with you about the Balkan Wars and the writers from the Balkan region. Many of those writers I really like still, and they influenced my reading behavior, I would even say. But also the region was discovered through this lens of trauma, of genocide, and that's not the whole story. I really like Ukrainian writer Sofia Andruchovich and her novel Amadoka about Ukrainian history will soon be published by Simon & Schuster, I suppose. It is just a really huge volume, so they need time to get it translated. But she always speaks that when she comes to speak to foreign audiences, she always wants to say that yes, we are in this war, but we are much more than the war, and every individual here has his or her story, and it is much bigger than war. So definitely it is also the bias. But when we speak about the metaphor of the window or of the door, there were so many people who knew really nothing about Ukraine and Ukrainian culture. There were different purposes why it was like that. But okay, now they discover something, and probably they discover there is Ukraine with the book by Alexander Mehet, and then they will go to any other literature, maybe even poetry. Because, for instance, one of the most powerful voices from Ukraine is Serhiy Zhadan right now. He also joined the military. He stays in his native Kyiv during all this time, and last year he joined the army. But his poetry was absolutely beautifully translated into English language by Virlyana Tkach and Wanda Phipps. It was published by Yale University Press, and it should be discovered because it tells about the war, but it tells about the people, and it is the main question. What are those people who live here? Why they are targets for Russia for so many centuries? And also, what makes they them? What makes them Ukrainians? Very general philosophical questions like, who am I? Why am I here? And what should I do with my life? And I think that there are many people in the world that want to discover this right now about Ukrainians.
How is it for Ukrainians though? Like, do Ukrainians know who they are, and how the full-scale war has influenced this identity and the sense of identity, the sense of understanding of who we are as a nation?
Identities are dynamic, and that's what all the theories from the 20th century tell us. And we feel it right now, that identities are always dynamic, and discovering who you are, it's always the process. Nevertheless, if there is war or there is no war, it is normal process for a human being which is alive. Of course, Ukrainians discover who they are right now in a very traumatic way, because Russians are very direct in their aims. They have genocidal speech, they commit war crimes, they say that they want to destroy the life here because people here are Ukrainians. And for people here, it still is the question, what does it mean to be Ukrainian? What are our values? How do we live here? If there is any difference between how do we live here and how do people live in Russia, but also in Poland, in United Kingdom, in Czech Republic, and that makes identity. But also we discover identities, as Benedict Anderson told us, through language and through narratives. And people want to understand which narratives are their big stories, which writers tell their stories, how the history of their language depicts the history of society here, the civil society here, because language has it inside of the language. So right now we see many changes, and I think that it is very different for the foreigners who come to Ukraine and they follow the situation, but also for people inside the country. And completely another story would be told by those Ukrainians who were forced to flee their homes, who need to stay abroad right now because of the war. So it is a very, very complex question, because identity of a 40 million nation is not a very simple thing.
Is the war accelerating it? Is it intensifying it? And is it perhaps taking the direction of identity in a different direction than it might have gone under peaceful circumstances? Or is this really a question that's too abstract, because the war is here and we can't know what might have happened in other circumstances, especially the move away from Russian language and more people adopting Ukrainian as their primary mode of communication, and even starting to read more in Ukrainian literature?
It's definitely difficult to say, but we may speak about the Revolution of Dignity from 2014. and we understand that it was followed by the set of the reforms. People wanted to live good here and to have a good governance, and somehow they understood that it is very tightly connected with the history of Ukrainians here and with the history of people who somehow chose Ukraine for themselves, because there were people who were able to pick this Russian identity, to move to Russia, to have career there. And there are many of people in Russia of Ukrainian origin, and not only those from the Soviet times. But the main tendency after the Revolution of Dignity was very obvious. There was a demand of knowledge about the region, but also about this country. People were asking themselves why they had this revolution, why they were talking constantly that they're Europeans. Because it is not the question just of the choice, it is the question of history and culture. And only when you dive into history and culture, you understand why Ukrainians say they are Europeans. Because it was chosen by the best writers, it was chosen by the best artists, and they were in different ways trying to speak about this.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, this leads me to ask questions about decolonization, the process of decolonization. So this word is, I feel like, especially within the last year and within Ukrainian media, Ukrainian context, this word is everywhere. So I guess the question I'm asking is also, like, does it have the risk of being oversimplified as a process, or oversimplified as a context, a concept in Ukrainian and probably global global discourse? What I mean is that, okay, so Ukrainians talk about decolonization, they give certain views, but then they go outside the country, they present it at certain events, and this is sort of the way this narrative is shaped. But does this sort of popularity make it also oversimplistic? So I guess that's the question.
Really, not so many people are ready to look at Russia through the theory of colonialism. We all know about Eva Thompson, who wrote this famous book about Russian colonialism in literature and culture. We know that Edward Said, in his book about imperialism, also writes that Russia is empire, but in this book I won't write about Russia because I focus on another topics and on another empires. I think that the problem with colonialism is a bit different. It is only one of the theories. And when we speak about any culture, not just Ukrainian culture, but any culture or any phenomena, we need to have different approaches. And I really don't like that we use this only approach towards Ukrainian culture. Because the essence of Ukrainian culture is not in the fact that that, for example, its best voices were murdered by Russia. No, the essence of Ukrainian culture is in the fact that those people wrote different literature, and there are different narratives in this literature. They, of course, were parts of different ideologies, sometimes even of different political parties. They had different tastes, like everywhere in the world. But we are trying only to focus on this very difficult and very tough discourse. And it is important discourse because Russia never faced responsibility for doing this. But it is not enough to approach Ukraine and Ukrainian culture only with this lens. What I also think is that we need to raise interest in Ukraine, and it is difficult because when you have interest in something, you get empathy towards this, and then you build relationship. I think that we are at this very stage because it is not enough just to publish a photo from wartime Ukraine and say, like, it is a tragedy because they are invaded. And this process of discovering something, it takes time. I believe that we are on this process, but also we need to get this broader approach to anything we speak about Ukraine. There is a book, I forgot the author, but it is entitled Empire Writes Back. And I think it is very powerful metaphor because even when we speak in this context about Ukraine as an independent state with very interesting culture, which gets us into many centuries and even thousands of years back in the history, we still speak about Russia. And this is the point when Empire Writes Back. Because we even had already named some names of Russian authors, but we named only few Ukrainian. Colonialism is only one of the possible theories, and I think that right now we face this problem because we need to address processes in a broader way and using more than one theory. But let's look, it always happened like that. There is something trendy and there are trending theories that many people want to use. Definitely colonialism is the point in Ukraine, but let me pose it in a different way. There were many intellectuals from Ukraine who were writing about the issue of colonialism in the context of Russia. Many of those people who were fleeing the Soviet Union after the Second World War and who are called the DPs, the displaced persons, like George Shevelyov, like Yevhen Malanyuk, like Vasyl Barka, and many of them, they created MUR, which is the art institution of Ukrainians who fled the Soviet Union and who understood that the fight for independence for now is lost. And they were asking themselves why it was lost, but also what can we do? How can we think about this? And they were writing about Russian colonialism, for instance, in the 50s, in 60s, in 70s. Then we had this perestroika by Gorbachev, and people also were speaking so much about the issue of colonialism and imperialism in a very good way. Probably one of the brightest voices was Solomia Pavlychko, who was a literary scholar, and unfortunately her main work for now aren't translated into English, but there are several essays that everyone can find. And she was trying to explain Ukraine and the context in which Ukraine regains independence. Also, there are good books by Tamara Hundorova, who writes a lot about the issue of colonialism and how it influenced culture here and the whole discourse. But also she writes, for example, about Chernobyl and how Chernobyl as a big catastrophe influenced Ukrainian culture. So I want to say that it is not something brand new. Often we speak about this like, wow, colonialism, it is a new thing. But let's look at the syllabuses of Kyiv Mohyla Academy from the early 90s. People were doing this all the time, but it was not a demand for the society. It was not a big trend. Right now, it is a big trend because people are abandoning something Russian in their life. But also, I think that here we have like two paths. And one path is this public discourse, and another path is what is done by the writers in academia, inside of the country, but also abroad, what is done by independent researchers. But of course, colonialism as a phenomenon, as a word even, it is trendy.
And okay, I have a couple of questions that arise from there. Basically, so colonialism is not a new thing in Western academia, especially, and I was wondering, what is it that is special about Ukraine in this sense? And what is it that Ukraine can teach say, Western academia and Western scholars and just Western public about this process, about itself? Maybe what is often misinterpreted or misunderstood about Ukrainian decolonization and this process happening now?
It's important for me to say here that I'm a reader. I'm not a researcher of colonialism. Rather, I'm a journalist. But what is important to point is what was written by Eva Thompson and also Edward Said, that Russia is a very special empire because it didn't have to cross any sea or ocean to find the colonies. It found colonies nearby. And that's first misperception that is frequently misunderstood by anybody in the world. Like, how can they colonize people who live close to them, their neighbors? It is first thing. But also there is very special Ukrainian thing, which is difficult to explain to many people outside academia. But for example, Serhiy Plokhy writes about this, and many of scholars, is that Ukrainians, of course, were a part of this empire. There were people who invested their intellect, energy, and work to make this empire flourish. And sometimes it is difficult to speak about this in a very simple way. There are no simple words for this, but it is very interesting to discover this through literature, cinema, and also good history books.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we have to sort of hide these influences? Because something that I also find as a tendency, and also probably this is the question to you as a journalist as well, in Ukrainian discourse is like, okay, so if we have something that is not as, represents us in such a good way, or so there is sort of like a risk of this, okay, let's not talk about that, let's shift from that. So do you think that sort of unpleasant parts of our history, or not nice parts of reality that is happening now, are as important as like sort of the best things that we have to offer?
In my work, I don't feel this, and among the good journalists, I really don't feel this, because if you are in the profession, if you do your job as a journalist, if you are a researcher or historian, you have some standards of your job, and you just need to have it done. So I don't feel this. And definitely it is not the point. I think that when people have kind of personal conversations, they want to hide something. But when you go to good history books, they are complex. They tell the big history, but it is difficult to tell all of the narratives in one book. You will not have one book, everything Ukraine. I'm often asked this, like, give us one book that will tell us about your country. And if I understand that people want really one book, I advise them Serhiy Plokhy, The Gate of Europe, because it will be one book, it is short, it is really very well written. But you will never discover everything in one book. One book can open you the door into identity, into history, into country. When we come to this question of yours, it is very interesting to discover this, like why those people went somewhere, why they did those or that decisions. I think that it is a really good material for books, for researchers. So many people can do good PhDs also on these issues. I think that Ukraine is good for anyone in academia, because so many topics are already taken and you will not do a PhD on this. And here you have so many topics, you have so many writers, so many issues, so many artists which are not known enough. It is also a really very good material for museums. Last year I was at Orsay in Paris, and I was fascinated by a modernist painter which was there. She was from one of the Nordic countries. And it was a new name for this museum because new names let us tell new stories. And I think that we lack new stories because so many of the stories were told from the big capitals because it is the question of influence. But also we need new stories just to enrich us as a big society, as a European family, as a world family.
It seems to me that some of this conversation is centering around nuance and complexity. And that's where the interesting stuff happens. Is there a risk as well when some of these things are debated and, Russian literature versus Ukrainian literature, or Ukrainians writing a more imperial or contributing to the imperial project, there emerges an idea that somehow there's a purity. Certain writers have a certain purity and others don't, and these ideas of loyalty and betrayal and so on, which perhaps might lose some of the interesting stuff in those that maybe made compromises or those that don't have this. And is there a geographical sense? I know historically it might have been thought that those in Lviv might have had that slightly more, the idea of Ukrainian purity. But it's perhaps, it's not maybe a helpful debate. It's quite a destructive thing because it'll say, this is canon, this is acceptable, this stuff isn't. We have to ignore it and tear it out. Am I simplifying here, or is this a real risk of the kind of debate we're talking about?
We don't have this in Ukraine. Like, even right now, people in the US are debating that the banned books list is getting bigger and bigger. We understand why, because there are changes in the US politics right now. We have a new president there. We don't have lists of banned books in Ukraine. Definitely, Russian literature is not sold right now. It is not that easy to get Russian books if you want to do this in Ukraine. In libraries, there are Russian books. In university libraries, there is Russian literature. Definitely, people are researching Russian literature. But Ukraine is in the state of genocidal war. Russians.
I didn't mean that's understandable.
Yes.
I didn't mean
Just
Russian
let me explain, please. Russians are committing genocide in Ukraine. And that influences the whole discourse. But when we move back to Ukrainian authors, I'm doing cultural projects in Ukraine, and since the full war began, I do this also. Last year, I was included as a curator of the new big literary fair dedicated to the books about culture. It was in Kyiv at Ukrainian House, which is right in the city center. And together with my colleague, we did everything we wanted. I don't feel that we have this paramount discourse of purity or something like this. Like, I think that it was when Germans burnt books, they spoke about the purity. But in Ukraine, it is not the question. Definitely, if it was, it would be dangerous. But we don't have this. And what I feel we lack right now is comparative studies inside of the country, but also outside of the country. Because I have a good friend, she is a journalist, she is a New Yorker, but she has been living in Chernivtsi for several years, Kate Surkan. And she often says me that sometimes Ukrainian literature reminds me of an island. People already know some names or titles, but unfortunately they don't see the ties with another literature. But there are very rich ties. 150 years here in Kyiv, Polish language was a common. Now not so many people know Polish here, and we understand why. Because times change and states change and everything changes. But I think that we should seek for these connections, connections between London and Kyiv, between Kyiv and Warsaw, between Lviv and Prague, and so on. I feel that when people, just regular readers, discover this connection, it brings them joy, because you see that you're not alone and you don't feel any solitude. probably it is the main thing that really culture, not propaganda, but culture gives us. Propaganda makes us feel alone and makes us feel helpless, but culture gives us space for the dialogue. And also culture shows us that yes, this world, it is very big and it is tragic. But somehow we are connected or can be connected. And that's what we really need, like not to ask ourselves about the authors from the 20s if they were communists or not, because it really doesn't matter. I'm much more interested in their artistic work and if they were futurists, if they did avant-garde, or if they were trying to make modernism. And that gives me this connection to, for example, some French poets, any poets. Because those people knew languages, they read books, they translated. And connections are really the key. And connections, they also let us, in this very difficult situation for all of us right now, I don't mean only Ukrainians, but let's say Europe, to feel this material of democracy, because it is built only on conversations and dialogue. Like we remember dialogues from the antique times. Europeans need dialogues. Mm-hmm. We are built on dialogues.
I just feel like this is something you're talking about is probably something that needs to happen both inside and outside, because I still remember our school literature and we had like separate Ukrainian literature and separate foreign literature. And I personally, so, it depended on the teacher, but in my case, I didn't see any connections or any ties. At the same time, it's something that needs to happen outside of Ukraine for people outside to understand that it's not just a country that emerged on the world map like suddenly in 1991, but it's actually a country that existed there for a while, people that existed there for a while, stories and ties that existed there for a while. And then when I mentioned about, for example, Balzac and that he was actually... he has a story in Ukraine, he has a story in Brtych, and so on. It's like, oh wow, come on, like how can that be? So I find it quite interesting, and I think there's a lot that needs to happen there. So thank you for making this point. Yeah, and so basically a question I have. So you mentioned stories and the fact that so you mentioned that stories, and we need new stories and more stories. So at the same time, propaganda, it operates in the environments that have probably too many stories or too much buzz. So like everybody is saying something, there's like not everything is that clear and so on, and that's where propaganda comes up, because okay, so you don't trust anything anymore. So I'm just wondering where probably the line is, or the boundary is, because again we also have this whole discussion about the crisis of legacy media, the rise of bloggers, of people who do alternative media, and then everybody's telling a story in a general sense, but where is the line between stories that need to be told and they contribute into something and stories that don't, especially when it comes to people who are not very deep into the context and they can't distinguish that easily?
I think that we were educated in the times when there was the theory of propaganda, which was built during the Second World War. Like you need to take all the information sources from the people and then you control them and then you spread your information. But right now it is definitely another situation, and it reminds me of a really great book by Timothy Snyder, The Road to Unfreedom, where he writes that you need to make people to believe in one big lie, and they will believe in all other lies. We can see this in Russian society. Timothy Snyder writes about Russian society in that situation. But also propaganda influences us everywhere In Ukraine, in European countries, in the US, in Asia, everywhere there are different ways of contemporary propaganda. What can I say? It is very difficult because when we go to the researchers by interviews which are conducted every year in Ukraine, but also similar researches are conducted in different countries, every year they say us that the trust to media is lower and lower, and people want bloggers and people want influencers. It is the tendency, and what can we do? I think that we also need to change our perception what is to be a regular media, probably to grow influencers inside of the medias. Because when we come to bloggers, unfortunately, bloggers will not work under the standards. They're not interested in Associated Press standards, for example. They won't read BBC standards, and they don't have to. We may have
they despise them, actually.
Yes, we may have these discussions about the standards and that bloggers, they have power and they need to follow the standards. But how will you make them? You will make bloggers register somewhere, then you become Russia. So it is also the question about freedom of speech, about the freedom of expression. And when we speak about human rights in general, in this case, freedom of expression, this all legal structure was built after the Second World War. World changed dramatically. Even when we come to the protests of Belarusians, so many people were caught just because there was a possibility to identify them. Several years before, in the beginning of the millennia, it wouldn't be possible, and that influences the right of the people to protest, right to revolution. So it is a very difficult question, but I also think that we need to seek the new legal framework, because this previous legal framework of freedom of expression, of privacy, it doesn't work because it is instrumentalized by autocracies, it is instrumentalized by people who don't want to be democracies, but they say, like, on the paper, we are democracy. We have elections. Yes, this president is our president for the third, for the fourth time, but we had elections. They were free. We have papers. We need to find instruments to change this.
And you know what I'm going to say, Yaroslava, because we have a slight, not
it's
even
an ongoing
of opinion.
discussion.
We're exploring the territory here. But it's my view that you talk about sort of BBC standards and both siding arguments and you know, I would say almost like a school debating format where you have certain rules there. When you have a period of consensus politics, that actually works rather well. When you're in an era, as we are now, of not just more extreme politics, but you have malign actors like Russia trying to weaponize the information environment, injecting huge amounts of money to inject sort of disruptive, provocative narratives in there and seeding it with agents and assets and useful idiots. I would argue that those formats no longer work. Those legacy media formats, despite the benefits of the rules, no longer produce a compelling result. Sometimes they themselves can fall into the trap of shallow media or even become misinformation themselves. So do you feel that there's a crisis of legacy media, and actually we need to experiment to find new ways of communicating these stories?
I also think that we need to discover cases, because there will always be people who would love to do an interview with a raper, for instance, and to ask a raper about his feelings. And maybe he or she doesn't think that it is a crime to rape or to kill somebody, to kill anybody. There will always be those people, and the question is that when you make an interview with a raper, it will give you likes, audience, comments, and it will get many viewers. But there is such thing as culture and ethics, and it sounds very old-fashioned, but that's the thing that works. And I will again move back to this post-war world, but the general infrastructure of the theory of human rights, how we know them right now, was built then to prevent new world wars. We know that, unfortunately, human rights don't prevent wars. But if it is our ideal and standard, we fight for this, like as Ukrainians here fight for freedom. Ukrainians protected their capital, and nobody believed that they will do this. But they protected their capital, they pushed the Russians back, they discovered Russian atrocities and war crimes in the region of Kyiv, like 15 or 20 kilometers from the place where we are having this conversation right now. And they did this for these invisible values that define their life. And I think that in such extreme conditions, we feel as human beings that there are values. Many people in this world are trying to convince us that there are no values. But then Ukrainian and international journalists go to the front line and communicate with the infantry at the 0 point. And they also speak about some values. They speak why they are there. They celebrate Christmas there. They think about their kids there. And those things, I think, are even bigger than us as individuals.
And this thing you mentioned, dialogue, because one of the challenges, and I've had conversations on the channel with Peter Pomerantsev, and of course some of the authors you mentioned earlier, including Sergei Blachy and others, and Timothy Schneider especially, the question is, how do you deal with propaganda? And of course it's evolving and it's moving, and there's many experiments taking place. But this idea of dialogue, I think, is a really important one, because dialogue is embedded in community and experience and, say, a body of literature and culture as well as human values. Whereas it seems to me that not just the discourse on social media, but the very algorithms that form the framework of social media are designed for provocation, to react to provocation, almost the opposite of dialogue. And is that simplistic, or could this point a way towards how we can tackle weaponized information in propaganda?
I think that all of us, we don't have all the energy and all the time in the world, and we have to decide. Some people can decide to combat propaganda directly, to debunk propaganda, and it is a very important job. But we also see that this is instrumentalized, because the time of those people is taken, and also they need to say this propaganda again to debunk it, like, this is not true, because the true is here. When it comes to cultural issues, which are my field of expertise, I don't spend my time on debunking many of Russian propaganda, because I don't have a lot of time. And if I have, for example, 10 minutes at international event somewhere, at European Parliament or anywhere, I will invest this time in speaking about Serhiy Zhadan, Vasyl Stus, Valerian Podmogilny, Oksana Zabushko, Sofia Andruchovich, or any other Ukrainian voice, because I just don't have space to invest it into helping Russians analyze themselves if they are imperialists or not, and what is the content of their literature. That's their job. Also, there are people who are Russian studies graduates, and it is their job to work with this. My job is Ukrainian culture, and when we speak about like field of interest, I'm much more interested why some of the Ukrainian authors were going to Poland, to Czech Republic, to France, to Belgium, to Germany, to United Kingdom, to US, to Canada. I'm really not that interested why they had something with the Russians.
And indeed, that grounding in something positive might actually be a better solution than constantly doing these kind of autopsies on these dead Russian narratives, focusing on something that's living and organic and positive. And I know that's what you do, but do you feel the solution could lie in perhaps moving away and say, do you know what, we're not going to give oxygen to this stuff?
Sorry, I'll just continue this question. This is also something that we discussed. It's like you come to events with Ukrainians and you ask them what to do with Russia. Like, what's the point?
It is very simple because people who do this, they stay at their field of expertise. They don't need to do any new research, any new job. Like they spoke about Russia before and they go on with this. It is also about this intellectual struggle to reshape imagination, not the imagination of another person, but your own imagination. And it is often very difficult and even much more difficult than to influence somebody. So, yes.
Yeah, and following up on this, I feel like a lot of communities, I mean, Ukraine is not the only country that is in the state of war. Ukraine is not the only country that's been invaded by Russia or ruined by Russia, even that's in state of war now. So if we come back to, again, like Syria, if we go back to Afghanistan, for example, it feels like all these narratives, they sort of live in their own bubbles. As in, like, Afghan people care about Afghanistan, they come to Afghan events. Ukrainians care about Ukraine, Ukrainians come to Ukrainian events. And at the same time, we talk about building of trust and this distant audiences, people who have not been through the warfare. And then you say about the need to change this imagination. So the general question I have is probably will be split in two. So first, can emotions and emotional proximity and empathy be a solution for that? So building it through personal stories to kind of break these boundaries and reach out to people. And second is, if so, then how do you do it, especially towards people who have never experienced that? This is the question to you as a journalist as well, probably.
It's difficult for me to get how it is at foreign events where we have like Ukrainian diaspora, Afghan diaspora, Syrian diaspora, and so on. But when we speak how it is inside of the country, I have a good friend of mine who is also a brilliant journalist, and she researches the legacy of Ukrainian dissidents who were the opponents to the Soviet regime, but also right now she works a lot with the issues of commemoration practices and how we commemorate fallen heroes, but also people who should go to Pantheon. Her name is Darka Hirna. She has a project which is called the Faces of Independence. It is in Ukrainian mostly. And with her, we often discuss this issue of solidarity because so many people really were and are victims of Russia and Russian imperialism. I also think that there are different ways of discovering this. Like you may discover if how we say ordinary people know something about this, but for me it is much more interesting to find this in Ukrainian culture. And it is very insightful to get poetry about Chechen wars, because there is poetry. There were even songs about the Chechen wars, which were very delicate. Also, we can find the memories of Afghanistan in different works of Ukrainian authors. Let's say about Artemchak, who is, by the way, also military right now. He is one of the most important, I would say, Ukrainian voices of contemporary literature. And his last novel before the invasion was about the Afghan veteran. So I think that culture really gives this explanation. Also, right now we are in Kyiv, and there were the couple of great artists who were working in the Soviet times. Unfortunately, I forgot the names, but I think that you should put them right now on the screen when you will work with this. They were working with that peoples of Russia, which are disappearing at that time in 80s, in 70s. So there was this dialogue constantly, but the question for us as people who read, who watch, who listen to culture is if we were interested in this art, because I feel that not enough.
And so you think this is sort of the same message that could be like expanded to other audiences, so like the need to be interested in what is going on.
At least we may show that it was. It is the question of being. Like we may translate some poetry which is about the Chechen wars and show that Ukrainians were reacting to Chechen wars. They were against Chechen wars and they were trying to find a way to depict it in Ukrainian art. So I really think that it is much more for people who research the issue. It is not for the broad audience, but we have these examples and in different kinds of art.
Yeah, Jonathan?
No, excellent. That was my questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we can sort of wrap up and probably continue in next conversations because this is just so interesting. Yes. I feel like it could be going on and on and on and like with more and more questions. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you to our colleagues in the Ukrainian media for hosting us today. Yes, I'm behind the screens that are present here, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you. We hope to have you as a guest on both of our channels soon in the nearest future, probably with more positive maybe conversations and more deeper conversations about Ukrainian literature as it gets translated and people get more and more acquainted to that. Yes, so thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It's great here being in Kyiv as well, feeling the texture of reality here, and hopefully better questions will emerge from that. But yeah, a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
I should say, I've had the pleasure of having a conversation before on the channel. So if people really, find a lot of value in this, do check out the previous conversation because it covers new, different ground to what we're talking about today.